Hi guys, welcome to the Tech Chat. My name is Tom, and this is my camera comparison between two of the best camera smartphones you can buy right now, the Samsung Galaxy S6 and the LG G4. So let's find out which is better. So while the G4 and the S6 have a fair bit in common in terms of the camera's sensor size, the use of optical image stabilization or OIS, and their ability to record up to 4K video, there are a few features unique to each. The G4, for example, uses a laser-assisted autofocus. It can capture images in the RAW format and also has a higher 8-megapixel front camera. The S6, on the other hand, offers a wider range of video resolutions it can record, from 4K, Quad HD to 1080p at 60 frames per second. So both phones are packed with camera technology, but it doesn't mean a thing if it doesn't take a good picture. So with the specs out of the way, let's find out how they compare in the real world. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty and look at some pictures. This first image is of a field with HDR enabled on both phones and demonstrates straight away how close this test is going to be. Both produce a bright, rich and detailed picture. In terms of the colour though, the S6 picture looks slightly more muted than the G4. Not dull exactly, just less vivid, perhaps a bit less vibrant than the G4. It's very close though, but I do prefer the brighter image taken by the G4, perhaps a result of the ever so slightly wider f1.8 aperture. On to the next image. My first impression is again that the G4's picture is brighter and slightly more pleasing to the eye. Although this could be a slight oversaturation of colours, however I would say the dynamic range is better on the S6, as even though it's a bit less bright overall, the dark areas on the S6 picture aren't as dark as the same areas on the G4. This would lead me to suggest the HDR on the S6 may be slightly superior. But if we zoom right in, they both retain an impressive amount of detail, and it's very close to cool, although I think the G4's picture is just a little bit more detailed. Now this next picture of a dark path is a good example of how the camera's HDR handles light and dark areas at the same time. Strikingly similar again though, but the S6 does appear to retain more light and more detail in the darker parts of the image. The S6 is also slightly less blown out in the bright areas. What is most noticeable though is the colour difference between the leaves. The S6 produces a slightly more muted, possibly more natural colour, whereas the G4 is definitely more vibrant and saturated, but personally I prefer the G4's colour. Now this picture of a sign is a clear example of the superior high dynamic range on the S6. With a dark foreground and a bright background, the sign on the S6 image is significantly brighter, which makes the writing easier to read. So thanks to its HDR, its live HDR, which doesn't require any processing, the S6 does take the win on this photo in particular. But in terms of colour, again, the G4 produces a far more vibrant and colourful image to the comparatively dull S6. From my own personal experience of the day, and the colour of the sky and the surroundings when I took these, I am now leaning towards saying the G4 isn't actually oversaturated and is in fact more natural. It's just the S6 is in fact slightly undersaturated and slightly muted. For me though, the S6 has taken the superior picture here thanks to its better HDR. The whole image is better and more rounded in terms of brightness and contrast overall. Analysing this Vista image shows the G4 has once again taken a brighter and punchier looking picture. Interestingly though, if we zoom in on the sky, the G4 retains a more natural blue, whereas the S6 leans towards a slight purple hue in the colour temperature. Moving on to a close-up shot, the G4 and S6 produce very similar images. Both are well lit and impressively detailed. However, zooming in again does show the G4's image is ever so slightly sharper and more detailed than the S6's. Now let's move on to a picture taken with the LED flash in low light conditions. Both cameras use a single LED flash, but straight away it's obvious the S6 has a much more neutral white flash compared with a more brown and orange looking G4. But for me the S6 wins this on the basis alone of having a much more natural colour from the flash. So having looked at those photos, it's becoming a little bit more apparent that the G4 is consistently producing brighter, slightly more detailed and actually just overall slightly better pictures than the S6. The G4's colours are a bit more vibrant, a bit punchier, and although perhaps at first glance they may appear to be oversaturated, I think actually it's the S6 which is a little undersaturated, and in fact the colours overall for the S6 are a little bit duller, a little bit more muted compared to the G4. Now that's not to say either are bad, they're both very similar in terms of both being incredibly high quality cameras, and you really can't go wrong with either. But put side by side, looking really in depth at both. The G4 is sort of just taking the lead, and overall I think is taking a nicer picture. So but of course stills and pictures are just one aspect of the camera. So now let's move on to take a look at the video. While both cameras are capable of recording 4K at 30 FPS, the S6 can also record in 1440p or Quad HD and also 1080p at 60 FPS, neither of which are offered by the G4. But in terms of video quality, the optical image stabilization on both does a good job of handling the camera movement from the strong wind. What I do notice though is how the S6 is quicker to focus. When the camera changes focus to the close-up shot of the grass, it takes the G4 a second or two longer to focus than the S6 despite its fancy laser-assisted autofocus. And also in contrast to the still images, the video on the S6 for me, to my eye, is a bit more detailed and even the colours appear to be more natural. It's an interesting role reversal, but the S6 is demonstrating the traits of the G4's superior picture quality in its videos. Although boasting fewer megapixels, the S6 does have a trick up its sleeve in that it can utilise the excellent live HDR on the front camera as well as the back. Interestingly though, the S6 has a much wider 120-degree field of view on the front camera, which allows it to capture more subjects in the wide-angle selfies, as the G4's field of view is comparatively small and narrow. Although neither had the slightly ridiculous beautify option enabled, the G4 does appear sharper and more detailed. Although the G4 perhaps takes a crisper selfie, the wider field of view on the S6 is generally quite useful, and I think overall makes the S6's front camera superior. In terms of the user interface, the camera apps on both phones cater to novices and experts alike, with great point and shoot auto modes as well as the pro and manual modes on the S6 and G4 respectively, allowing you to change, among other options, the white balance, ISO and focus, for example. Interestingly though, the G4 does also have the ability to capture images in the RAW format as well as the more standard JPEG. RAW images are generally larger in size and better for post-processing and editing. However, in my experience with the G4, there isn't really any noticeable difference between the RAW and JPEG in terms of quality or even file size, surprisingly. So both excellent, both very, very capable phones, and you really can't go wrong with either. And this is the thing, we are coming into an area of diminishing returns. There's not a lot of difference between them, and they're both fantastic cameras, and I'd be happy to use either as my primary camera phone. But if putting together, some people do want to find out the best of the best, and for me personally, the best here, just by a small margin, is the G4 for its slightly superior stills. And so I think that will round up this camera comparison between the LG G4 and the Samsung Galaxy S6. Thank you very much for watching. As always, if you have any comments or you think I've said something wrong or missed something, please let me know, and I'll try and get back to you. I do read all the comments. For more, please check out the techchap.com website, and of course follow me on Twitter at @techchap. Don't forget to subscribe, of course, and hopefully I'll see you again next time. Cheers guys.